For quite some time I've been making game boards like this one. Today I'm going to tell you how I do it. My name is Ian Currey and this is Thinking Out Loud. Come on, let me tell you what I think. Hello. This is a great game called Joker Marble. We play this either with family or friends often and have found it to be a very enjoyable pastime. I was introduced to the game by a friend who told me all about it. At first I thought, oh, that's just a kid's game. It sounds simple enough. But as I've played it, I've found the strategy needed to actually win a game makes this a very good game indeed. And while children can play it, the more you play, the more interesting it becomes. Today I'm not going to tell you about the secret strategies of how to play or even the rules. Instead, we're going to think about how we make the game instead. Now, you can find Joker Marble on the craft sites where others have put their own twist on the design and so on. And if you feel like paying a king's ransom for it, you can also find versions of it on some of the online shopping sites. But why would you do that when you can make one yourself? Let me tell you how I do it. Now, there are several problems to overcome and lots of things to think about before we dive in. So I'd better try and make this make sense in a logical and methodical way for you, hadn't I? First, the board has a strange number of places for the marbles. That means that when we're measuring things out, they won't evenly divide nicely. Then the marbles need to be rather larger than the standard wee ones that we so often have laying around, and so those can be difficult to get hold of easily. The holes or divots the marbles sit into must be the same circumference as the marbles, but under half the depth of the circumference, or you'll never get them out once you drop them into their places. At the same time, they need to be deep enough to nicely hold the marbles in place. The board itself ends up needing to be rather large. Now, wood that size, unless you use MDF or ply, and don't, isn't available off the shelf, and so we have to make a board. To make the board, we first select dry wood so that it has less tendency to warp. Then we cut the wood into shorter boards and glue them together. The longer boards are cut using a chop saw like this one. The boards then need to be glued together side by side. That sounds easier than it is. In reality, there are a number of steps we need to take to make the boards joint side by side without leaving a gap between them. Two fantastic pieces of equipment that would really help in this process are called a jointer and a thickness planer. Now, one of these days I'll save up for a thickness planer, but the jointer you can easily work around. There's a lot of tricks people use to avoid needing a jointer, but some of those are very successful. The whole idea here is that you need to have edges that are perfectly together, that the joints need to be compatible and usually flat and smooth. One exception that I've managed to use a couple of times is to stack the two pieces on top of each other. When I'm cutting them, we overlap them and cut both boards at the same time. The edges, since being cut at the same time, even if you have a wiggle in your cut, should fit together perfectly. I make the cut either on a table saw or even on a circular saw using a jig or a guide to keep the saw in a straight line. Now you have boards ready, long bar sash or pipe clamps need to be available to help hold everything together while you glue it. Once everything is glued and dried, you can cut the board to its final size. It needs to be perfectly square or the divots won't line up properly. Now it's time to mark out where those marble divots need to be. The measurements are always awkward and it's really easy to mess it up. I use a special routing bit like this one that sits in a plunge router that accurately digs out the little divots. I think there's a total of 108 divots, at least I think that's how many there are. Then it's on to the next stage. The board needs to be finished and protected. But first, I run a trim router around the edge to give it a nice fancy edge. Even at this late simple stage, it's quite possible to really mess things up. Recently I had a board that was almost finished and the router bit was in the chuck not quite tightly enough and it moved, allowing the guide to go under the board, and it carved a wonderful chunk out of the side of the board. It was almost finished, but the board, of course, was ruined. Now I use sandpaper up to a very least grit of 220 grits or higher to give it a lovely smooth surface. But now cleanup is exceptionally important. Before we move on to anything, dust and paint or varnish simply do not go together. One of these days I'll help myself by installing the dust collection system properly and not coating everything with that fine mist of sawdust that seems to get everywhere. But once we've cleaned up, it's time to finish the board. I use coloured paint like these, usually acrylic, to mark the marble home bases and then give the board 3 coats of varnish with a light sanding between the coats. Each coat has to be left to dry too, or you'll make an awful mess. Rushing and not taking time is the easiest way to mess things up. Now, all of this might be very interesting to you. Or perhaps it isn't interesting at all and you've wondered, what on earth have I tuned into this week? Let me explain. While I may sound like I know what I'm talking about, and I've explained in some detail how to make Joker marble boards, you haven't actually seen me carry out a single one of the steps I described. I've shown you a couple of boards, even shown you the tools I use and the finished product, of course, but how do you know it was me that made them, or me that used the tools? I could have saved a whole lot of time, especially of me talking, by simply demonstrating how to use a router or a thickness planer, even if I had one. The whole construction process is quite rewarding to watch and far more interesting than listening to me. Certainly than listening to me tell you how to do it. Perhaps when I next make a batch of these things, I'll take you to the garage with me and show you instead of telling you how to make these game boards. Perhaps some of you are seeing where this rather long illustration is going. Have you ever watched a how-to video and thought, oh, that's simple, anyone can do that? This would be true of making marble Joker games. There are a few tricky things to watch out for and a few skills that need practice, but almost anyone with a moderate level of everyday hand skills can do this. In other words, the vast majority of those of you watching. The point is that I think perhaps that of those of you watching, almost none of you will have actually made one of these games. And despite my detailed explanation, most of you are never going to try it. You may recall I've been reading the writings of James recently. There's something I noticed again there that relates to this. Let me show you. What good is it, dear brothers and sisters, if you say you have faith, or in our illustration, woodworking skills, but don't show it by your actions? Can that kind of faith help anyone? Suppose you see a brother or sister who has no food or clothing, and you say, goodbye, and have a good day. Stay warm and eat well. But then you don't give the person any food or clothing. What good does that do? So you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. James goes on to have a discussion about the relationship between faith and good works, and how some think one can exist without the other. The way I've described how to make a game board today is a bit like that, isn't it? From what you've seen, you would have a hard time believing I was any kind of carpenter, wouldn't you? You haven't actually seen me make anything. James puts it this way: how foolish! Can't you see that faith without good deeds is useless? Or perhaps words without action is useless? Or maybe describing how to do something without actually showing you what I'm talking about is equally useless. Certainly, those of us who say we follow the teachings of Jesus have a responsibility to either stop pretending we do that or get on and live like we actually believe what we say. Those are fighting words, aren't they? It's so easy to have opinions or to know how to do something and say, anyone can do that. Actually doing it, putting faith into action as it were, is much harder, isn't it? Now, if you'd like me to make you one of these boards, let me know. But remember, they cost a king's ransom. Until next time, goodbye.